Hello everyone, so yeah, I'm Amy. I'm a technical product manager, which loosely translates into I was a software dev until about January this year, and now I'm trying my hand at the product side of things. And in both cases, I worked on this particular A/B testing tool, so I should know about it. So I'm going to start by saying I thought about just saying everything I know about the A/B testing tool and what we did, and then I realized my interpretation of it is very different to other people's. So I decided to structure it more around frequently asked questions, so what people want to know about the tool that they've asked me and the team. The testing tool that we have in-house is called Amat, and actually the most frequently asked question is, why is it called Amat? So I thought I'd tackle that first so that you know when I mention it throughout the talk what I'm talking about. This is an Amat. It's an Egyptian goddess. It has the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the back end of a hippopotamus. And the story goes that when you die, your heart is given to Anubis, another Egyptian goddess, and she will weigh it up against the feather of Mat. And if your heart is deemed to be pure, you can proceed on into immortality. And if it's not, then your heart is devoured by an Amat, or Amat. And actually, it does make a lot of sense because headline A/B testing is essentially you're putting up a hypothesis for judgment. And if it's deemed worthy, then it goes off into immortality or goes on to the website for the foreseeable future. And if not, you really have to just bin it. So editorial team, one of the editors came up to us and said, we've got this A/B testing tool. Can I test the headlines? We said, well, that's interesting. They said, imagine we had a story such as this one. What would IKEA build next? And the hypothesis was if we wrote a punnier headline, that may or may not be a real word, but a headline with more puns in it, for this particular story, more users would read it. This was our first problem because saying more users will read it, what does reading it actually mean? So what we always say is, what does success look like for this particular test for you? What are you looking to get out of this? So we had a chat, and it was decided that the primary metric for the headline testing would be click-through rate, which essentially means of all the people who landed on the page and saw this particular headline, how many of those clicked through and read the story. But getting the most clicks isn't always enough. And we do have to think about other things. And if we just chase clicks, we'd end up writing headlines like this. 10 things you'll never believe about IKEA's plans for the future. And we don't want to go down that route. We shouldn't just chase clicks. We need to think about other metrics. So maybe it's not your primary metric. Maybe you're not looking for significance with that metric. They're just secondary. But it's important to have extra things in mind about what will be impacted. So in this case, it would be something like time on page and scroll depth. So that's of the actual article once the user gets there. This is basically, we want to make sure that we're not mis-selling by having a really jazzy headline and then actually it's about something completely different with the article and people get disappointed. We don't want that. And also we need to remember the FT brand. So that particular headline wasn't really in keeping with the sort of tone of the FT. This is what actually happened. So these two were real headlines that went out onto FT. Just slightly punnier one on the right about unpacking and redesigning and things. We want to have a guess which one won. So hands up if you think that headline A got a higher click-through rate. Few more. And hands up if you thought headline B got a higher click-through rate. Interesting. I'll tell you later. So once we decided that that's a good test to run, we've got our metrics sorted, the next thing that people want to know is how long is my test going to take? There's a couple of factors involved. Two of them are uplift and traffic. So uplift is really, what are you hoping will happen to your primary metric? How much are you thinking that click-through rate is going to increase? And traffic is just how many people are going to actually see this particular test. We really like headline testing because it's right up there. The two headlines tend to be really quite different. And it's usually at the very top of the front page, and so lots of people are going to see it. So we really like doing headline testing. Just for some context, other tests, these are just hypothetical tests. We didn't run these. if we were to have just completely redesigned the whole of the footer, that would have probably been quite a big change, but the number of people who get all the way down to the footer is quite low. So it's not as kind of positive a test for us. And similarly, if we'd have swapped something in the order of the nav bar, loads of people are going to see that. It's right on the top of every page, but it's barely perceptible change, so that's not as good either. So we ask everybody who wants to run a test, can you have a look at this tool? They input various things. At the top there, average visits, that's essentially like traffic. The current click-through rate, what the status quo is, expected uplift, that was a y-axis, and size of the smallest group, the toggle along the bottom, that's basically like saying how many variants are there. So if you've just got a test that has control and variant, that's a lot better than if you say I've got a test where I've got control and then I want to test 3 variants. It's going to take a lot longer for traffic to filter through into each of those variants in order for you to see whether there's been enough of a change or not. So we ask everybody to do this, and that comes out with whether it's a sensible time frame for us to run this test. You've got your test, you've got your metrics, you've decided it's a sensible time frame. The next thing people ask you is there traffic available for this test? In order to answer that, we need to know what is traffic and when it might be unavailable. So we split all of our users on ft.com into 100 different buckets. 100 is just an arbitrary number. It was easy to work with. We thought 10 wouldn't give us enough flexibility and 1,000 was a bit overkill, so that's why it's 100. And we make every ft.com user sit in a bucket. Not really. And it's a little bit like Tetris. So the user comes along, and this one will sit in this bucket. Another user will come along, and they'll sit in that bucket. The way we decide where you're going to sit, which bucket, is just seed randoming against your user ID. So there's nothing fancy involved. It's just random. So why do we make users sit in buckets? Let's take this. This is another just hypothetical test. 2 different layouts at the top of the front page. So we've got 3 stories. On the top one, we've got 3 stories on the right, the top one being about Costa Coffee. And on variant B, we've got 3 stories under the image, and then the Costa Coffee story is in its own box on the right. Hypothesis being, if we change the layout from A to B, the overall clicks on the component would increase. And that's fine. That's a great test. But if an editor comes along and says, that Costa Coffee story, I'd like to run a headline test on that. I want to change it, so I want to have headline B as something different. If we were to then, so a user who comes in and goes on B for the layout and B for the headline, if they were to then click on that Costa Coffee headline, we wouldn't really be able to say that they clicked on it because it was a better headline, or is it just because it's in a big prominent box compared to the other one? So that's where we start getting into problems. And so what we do is we target the test for different buckets. So in the example we've just shown, we could put the layout test here. So everybody in these first, say, 30-ish buckets would see the layout test, and they wouldn't see a different headline at all. Everybody in that layout test would just see the same headline, but they'd have different layouts. And we'd put the headline test next to it. So the headline test would be to completely different buckets of users. We also need to know which tests are already running. This is what tests look like in our world, just JSON object. Got some details there about the name of the test and who's responsible. But the real meaty bit is down here, which I've just blown up there on the right. It's the Amit setup. The most important bits here are offset 1, which basically means start at bucket number 1. Range 30 means move across 30 buckets. So we're saying here, I'd like this test to show to all users in the first 30 buckets only. Got something there called cohorts, which is subscriber, which means of all the users who are in those first 30 buckets, only show this test to the subscribers in those buckets. And then we filter further, so URL patterns. If you go to ft.com and land on an article, you'll see the URL is ft.com/content/something ID of the article. So this is basically saying, I want to show this test only to people landing on article pages. So we're kind of narrowing the scope all the time. So that means this onward journey, it was called sit somewhere around here on the first 30 buckets. And it's to subscribers, and it's only on the article page. Take another one, so exactly the same thing, just looking at the Amit setup. Offset here is 31, so saying start at the 31st bucket, move along 20, and this is also only showing to subscribers and only showing on the article page. So that one would go alongside this particular test. The users in these particular buckets, we're saying here, only show these tests to the subscribers in those buckets. But there's also going to be people in there that aren't subscribers, who we call anonymous. And what we can do is we could run, say, a barrier test. So the barrier is what we call our paywall. So when you arrive at ft.com, if you don't have a subscription and you're trying to read an article, you'll be presented with a paywall. So what we can do is we can actually put this test across all of the 100 buckets of users, because the users who were subscribers will fall into the first test here, whereas the anonymous people will just trickle down. So we may as well show them a different test. And we proceed on like this with this kind of swim lane thing. And so the layout test we saw earlier, the one with the Asda and Sainsbury layout story, that is only on the front page. And so we can show that alongside these other tests. So if you were trying to access an article and you're a subscriber, you'd see the first test. Anonymous, you'd see the second test. If you were a subscriber but you're trying to look at the front page, you'd look at this third test here. And that's how we decide where tests go and who sees these different tests. So we'd ask, what sort of test is it? So in this case, the person is saying, can I run a headline test? So the headline tests always happen on the front page. And so we say, well, we've got some traffic available here, but that's more for article pages. But we've got a big load of traffic here, so you can put your headline test here. Sometimes there isn't available traffic. And what we get asked then is, can my test overlap? This happens a lot because everybody has a great idea for a test and they all want to run them. At the point at which they decide they've got a great test, that's when they want to run it. And if we say, no, there's no traffic, then they'll say, okay, well, can I overlap my test with another test that's going on? This is another hypothetical test. We have actually got a test just like this running at the minute, but it's a little bit complicated. So this is just a simplified version of what's currently running. So somebody's come along and said, okay, I've got this hypothesis. If we remove this kind of blurb of information here, I think that the more people who arrive at this barrier site will then take out a subscription, because maybe this is confusing or it's too much information. And so we say, okay, we'll run that test, blurb or no blurb, across 100% of all the people arriving at that barrier page. Then somebody else comes along and says, well, hang on, I've got this great hypothesis. I think that if we make all these buttons red, then more people are going to take out a subscription. So then we're in a bit of a dilemma, because we've put the other test on 100% of traffic. So what we could do is put the blurb, no blurb test just on the first 50 buckets of traffic, and then put the green button, red button test on the other 50% of traffic. Or we could run the blurb, no blurb test for 100% of users until it's finished. And once it's finished, we could then take it down and put the green button, red button test across all of the traffic. Or, third option, we could run an MVT, which is a little bit like, it's like a combination test. So you basically combine all the different variants together. So here you'd have the control with blurb green buttons, you'd have blurb red buttons, no blurb red buttons, and no blurb green buttons as your 4 variants. It doesn't exactly look like this, but just to kind of visualize, it's essentially one long test across 100% of traffic, but split up into 4 variants. But the problem with all of those ways of doing it is somebody's going to have to wait, or everybody's going to have to wait a bit, which is very hard for stakeholders to listen to when you say that. And so what we've decided to do recently is try overlapping some tests. Where, this is a caveat, where we think the interference is going to be small. So what we do is we'd run the blurb, no blurb test across 100% of traffic, and at the exact same time, we'd run the green button, red button also across 100% of traffic. And so everybody's happy. And then you might think, well, why haven't you just been doing that before if everybody's happy and it's all going really well? Again, these are made-up numbers, so don't call me out on the maths. But if we were to look at the blurb, no blurb test that's just been running and put blinkers on and say, I don't care whether the people saw green or red buttons, all I'm interested in is whether they saw a blurb and no blurb, and say that everybody who saw a blurb, of those people, 10% of those took out a subscription. whereas only 9% took out a subscription when they had no blurb. So from that, we can say, okay, well, the winner must be blurb. We do the exact same thing with the green button, red button. We put blinkers on. We say, I don't care whether they saw a blurb or no blurb. All I'm interested in is whether they had green or red buttons. We do the same, and it looks like green buttons were the winner. Great, so we've got an answer. So we should have blurb and green buttons. That's the winner going forward. That's the top left one. But what actually might happen is if we were to run this as an MVT test, for some weird and wonderful way that we don't know, and this is quite a simplistic test, but there are usually a lot of moving factors going on and things you haven't thought about. So for some reason, actually, no blurb and green actually had a much higher rate of people taking out a subscription. So we've actually chosen the wrong thing earlier. And what we should have done is chosen this variant, so no blurb and green buttons. So overlapping would speed things up. That's why we're trying it. But there are risks associated. It's not a magic pill. This always makes me laugh. So people say, can you just quickly check that my headline test is okay? And the analogy I like to use is it's kind of like going into the doctors and saying, I know you've only got 10 minutes, but when I'm age 80, am I going to be okay? Because there are lots of things going to happen. We don't know what the kind of configuration of your genes is. We don't know who you're going to interact with between now and 80 years old. We can't possibly predict that. But people like to know that everything's going to be fine. So we do a few checks. We do actually check that the test has gone live. Sometimes it doesn't always get turned on. And how we test that is, let's say somebody tries to get to ft.com in their browser. They go through various things and then end up in something that's in-house that we built called Preflight. What Preflight does is it just asks a load of questions to a load of different things. One of the things it asks some questions of is Amit. And it says, I've got this user who's just trying to access ft.com. Here's their user ID. Would you like me to show them any tests today? And Amit will say, OK, let me go and have a look. First, it will go and have a look at the tests that are actually running. And it will come back and say, OK, this is what we saw earlier. These are the tests that are running. And here we can see the headline test is in there. So the headline test is live. That's great. Then we need to answer the question, are users actually being shown the test? So we need to know which particular users should be seeing it, because it may not be all of the users. So let's take a user that's been seed randomed, and they've ended up in this particular bucket here at something like 45. They'd only see the particular tests that they intersect with as they go down. So what we can do is we can just get rid of the other tests, because this particular user won't ever see those tests anyway, so let's not worry about those. One of the other things that Amit does is it calls out to various different things that I've lumped together as user data. Let's say in this case, the user data comes back and says this particular person is a subscriber. And Amit says, OK, well, that particular barrier test, that's just going to anonymous people, so that's not important for this user. So I'm going to get rid of that one as well. Amit also does putting you into a different variant. I won't go into how it does it, but it's basically just seed random again, but it's seed random against the name of the test. So it means you're never, as a user, in control for every different test or variant for every different test. You'll flip out between all of them, and it's just random. So in this case, for this particular audio test, they're in the control, but for the headline test, they're in the variant. And Amit passes all that information back to Preflight. And Preflight then says, well, hang on, this particular person was trying to access ft.com, which is the front page. So that audio test, that's to the article page, so I can forget about that as well. So we get rid of that one. So now Amit says, OK, so the only thing is the headline test, and they need to be in the variant for that. And Preflight will pass that information onto the front page app. Another check we do, are users seeing the correct variant? So we just found out that they're in this particular user is in the variant for the headline test. So we need to check that. So the front page app is made up of lots of different story slots. This is what the front page looks like. And each of these little boxes is a story slot, and they're called teasers. So this is what the front page is kind of building, what the app is building. Each particular teaser, as it's being built, will ask a number of questions. It will say, is the headline test on? Is the user in the test? And are they in the variant? And based on the answers to those 3 questions, it knows whether to show that user the control or the variant headline. So we've got all that information here. So we know they're in the headline test. The headline test must be on because they're in it, and they're in the variant. And we did about 4 or 5 of these tests, and it was all going great. Then the editors said, we've got this really big story coming up. Would you mind testing it? We said, yeah, sure. And they said it's going out at 3 a.m. So we very, very quickly re-engineered this because we didn't want to get up at 3 a.m. And we changed the questions that were asked. And we changed them to, we just put the headline test on all of the time. And then we changed whether we started measuring it based on whether there were 2 headlines or not for that particular story. How do we know there's 2 headlines? Well, when the two editors add their different headlines, they go through the content pipeline, and it ends up in Elasticsearch. And this is what the Elasticsearch for this particular article looks like. So that's the ID of the IKEA article. And we say, have you got a promotional title, which is what we call headline? And also, have you got any other alternative headlines? So in this case, have you got a variant? So promotional title variant, i.e. headline variant. And this comes back, so yes is the answer. We've got a headline, and we've got a headline variant. So now the teaser can answer those questions. So it says, if there's a promotional title variant, so there's a headline B, and they're in the headline test, and they're in the variant of the headline test, then show them the variant headline B. If some or all of those are not true, then show them just the standard headline. So based on that, we know that we'll be looking at this one for this particular user. The next thing that people want to know is which variant is winning. Now, if you imagine QI, anybody who's watched that, the klaxon going, that's not what you should ask. That's a naughty question. Why? Because that is peaking. And peaking is bad. Why is peaking bad? Well, if you imagine somebody comes up to you and says, I've got this coin, could you tell me whether it's a fair or a weighted coin? And you say, sure. So you start flipping, you get a head, you get another head, and they say, thanks. Okay, that's great, so it must be weighted then. And you say, well, whoa, hang on a minute. I've only flipped it twice. They say, but every time you flipped it, 100% of the times you flipped it, you've got a head, so it must be weighted, right? You say, well, no, we need to do a bit more. We need to wait a bit longer and get some more data. So fair enough. So off you go again, you get tails, another head, another tail, and they say, great. Okay, so surely we've got enough information by now. What they've done on both of those times is peak, and what they've got on both occasions is a false positive. They thought they got the answer, but actually, if we'd done this a bit longer, say 500 times, which incidentally still wouldn't be enough to get statistical significance, but if we'd done it 500 more times, it's now looking like tails might be the winner. So it is weighted, but in the other direction. So that's why peaking is bad, because you get an increased number of false positives. So how you should run a frequentist test is that you should estimate the duration of the test up front based on that little tool calculator. You collect data, and then when the test duration is over, and only then you should check the results, and you'll get whether it's significant or not significant. So what you should ask instead is not which variant is winning, but once you've weighted, which variant won. How do we know that? Well, when a user lands on ft.com, and we know they're in variant B, this page view event will be sent off into our data pipeline. So it says, user has seen this particular page, and that's who the user is. If they were to then click on headline B for this particular article, a click event would get sent out with who the user is and what story they've clicked on. All those events then flow through our data pipeline and into Redshift, but that's only what we use for normal A/B testing. So A/B testing that usually takes 4 or 6 weeks, say, that can all flow into Redshift. Problem with Redshift we have is that there's loads of these events going all the time, and the events table in Redshift is big. And anyone who's doing SQL queries on Redshift, if it's a big table, you know that the queries can take a very, very long time. For headline testing, this was just too slow, because for headline testing, you need real-time data analysis, because if you wait a few hours while you're querying the database, the headline's already fallen off the front page anyway. So what we did is we replaced Redshift with something called VaultDB, which is a really fast in-memory database, which meant that we were able to build this. I'm not a UXD person, so please excuse this. So this is what the editors use. So they would input the ID of the article, the timestamps when it went live, or they might want to look at a particular time frame, and it spits out something that looks like this. So it says what the subscription of the user was, and which variant they're in, what the page views were, what the headline clicks were, what the click-through rate is far side. Behind the scenes, there's all the clever stats stuff going on. And at the bottom, I don't know if you can see, but it'll basically tell you whether it's significant or not. So the editors, once they put a headline up, they can look at this, see whether it's significant, and then they can take the test down and put just the winner up. And it all happens in, I think most tests happen for the headlines in about an hour or so. So back to this. So most of you thought B, and you were right. So B was the winner in this case. But not every test reaches significance, and this is also something that causes us a bit of problems. And what people want to know is, was it close to significance? And this is another klaxon. No, don't ask this. This is a naughty question again. Because we know why people ask it, because we say, please can you wait X number of weeks while we run this test? You're not allowed to look how it's going or anything. And at the end, all we're going to tell you is significant, which is great, or we're just going to tell you, no, not significant. And that's a little bit like this. We told you to wait for ages, and then we just say no. And people say, well, can you just give me a little bit of a hint? Was it close to significance? Shall we just do it anyway? And we can't answer that, because this is kind of what the definition of reaching significance is. It's if B performed better than A, and if we were to run this experiment 100 times, on less than 5 of those occasions, the observed difference between B and A would actually have occurred by random chance, which is a little bit hard to digest, because you're just saying, this didn't happen. And people say, what does that mean? But not that. That's all you can say. And so to try and combat that sort of desperation of people asking, please just tell me a little sign, we have started looking at Bayesian. So frequentist is the way we are doing tests now, and we started looking at Bayesian. I'm not a stats person, so I'm sure there's probably many of you know more about this than I do. This is just how I think about it. So Bayesian testing, imagine that coin we had earlier, whether it was fair or weighted. Somebody gives you that, and you're in a casino, and you've got all your chips laid out, and says, let's start some betting. You'll say, well, I've no idea. We've never seen this coin flipped. So I'm just going to spread all of my chips out pretty evenly. So the kind of, all your line of chips is quite kind of even at the minute. You flip it a few times. You say, okay, I flipped it twice, and I got heads twice. So I'm kind of feeling a little bit more like it might get ahead the next time. So I'm going to move all my money slightly over a little bit to that side. You go again. Now you've actually got a tail this time. So you can say that you no longer is the probability of getting ahead a 1. So you move your money slightly back this way. And on this goes. And what ought to happen, hopefully, is for tests, is you gradually kind of get a narrower and narrower little peak, and that's your answer. There's a number of kind of good things about this. One is you have something that people can look at. It's also all done in terms of probability, which is what a lot of people can understand, much more so than 100 times at random. And also, it means that stakeholders can peak, which is good, and they can decide to stop the test when they like. Now, so if they wanted to stop it after you'd flipped it twice, they'd be a bit silly, but they could. It's up to them. And so we're trying that out at the minute and seeing how that goes. We're running it alongside the frequentist testing and just seeing what we get for the two different things. So that's all the questions that people ask of us. I've got one more question to ask of everybody else, which is which headline won. So I'm going to show you, these were all live tests that went out on ft.com. I'll let you have a read of those. We've got some alliteration here on the left, and then we've got a bit of a pun on the right. So hands up if you think that headline A got a higher click-through rate. Okay. And headline B? Yep, you guys are right. Got another one here. So the only difference between these two is that the one on the left says in 4 charts. Hands up if you think the in 4 charts one had the higher click-through rate. Okay, and, oh, I've done too early. I've done too early. It's this one. Another one, so this is best things I have read, so FT is giving their opinion, and B is a question. So hands up if you think that A had the higher click-through rate. Okay, nearly half, and hands up for B. Okay, in this case it was A. So usually headlines that have a question are usually the ones that win. But in this case we think possibly because people come to the FT for the FT's opinion on things. So maybe that's why this one was the case here. This one about Uber and Amazon. So hands up if you thought A. One brave person. Hands up for B. Yeah, it was B. And this one's actually really interesting because we were kind of wondering at the time whether we ought to measure images. So we don't do any tests on images. But what we found out that many of us hadn't really thought of is that when you click on an image, that also goes to the article page. Or if you click on the headline, that goes to the article page. But they're 2 different clicks. And we were sort of asking ourselves, should we be measuring people who click on just the images? Because they're not actually clicking on the headline. So we were working out whether we should count those or whether we should test the images. Do the images make any difference? So we were thinking of putting a really quite dull image in the other side and looking whether that made a difference to this particular test, because maybe people are just drawn to the kind of brands. And that's something we're looking to do in the future, is test the stand first, which is that kind of bit of a summary there, and also testing images as well. This one, I love this one. This is, we've got Shifty Shades of Grey on the left, and something slightly less interesting on the right. So hands up for A. Okay, and hands up for B. Little confession, this one was inconclusive, but I just wanted to put it up because that is just brilliant. Shifty Shades of Grey. So this one was inconclusive, so we don't know which one won. Fools, it was clearly this one. And this is my favourite one because who doesn't love a panda gif? So here we've got panda politics, and on the right we've got China's diplomatic weapon of choice. So hands up for headline A. Okay, and hands up for B. No, you guys are wrong, it was A. A was the winner. And that's all. So thank you very much.